Welcome to today's Virtual Digital Economy seminar. It's fantastic to see all of you again. Today's moderator will be Reinhold Kesel at the University of Zurich, and he will also introduce the speaker momentarily. Let me just remind you about the format. If you have any clarifying questions during the talk, please post them in the chat. Reinhold will manage the queue and unmute you so you can ask your question directly. We'll also use the same channel to collect questions for the Q&A after the talk. And quick reminder, the session will be recorded and we'll make it available on YouTube. So if you do ask a question, then you will appear on the recording. Without further ado, very happy to hand over to Reinhold.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. I'm very excited to have Chiara Farronato here today with us. And she is an assistant professor at Harvard Business School and a faculty research fellow at the NBER. And she does research at the intersection of I/O and digitization. And looking into her studies, not only are these published in well-renowned journals, but the relevance to the current policy debate also becomes very much apparent with important work on online peer-to-peer markets and the impact of such platforms on traditional industries. And so it's not a surprise that also today she brings us another interesting study that resonates well with the current emerging interest of competition authorities around the world to look further into mergers in the digital sphere. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk. Chiara, thanks for coming, and the screen is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reinhold, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. This is joint work with Jessica Fong and Andrey Fradkin, respectively at Michigan and Boston University. And I'm excited to get it started. The motivation for this paper really comes from increasing worries over the market power of digital platforms. Some of the most valuable companies in the world are platforms. A lot of these platforms have engaged in mergers and acquisitions, especially early on when at least one of the merging companies were small and just starting. And at least a justification for mergers and large platforms from a consumer welfare perspective is that of network effects, is the fact that combining two platforms may provide a higher value to each and every user, every participant, than the sum of two competing and separate platforms. Of course, the merging platforms have many other reasons for engaging in a merger or in an acquisition, but we're really focusing on the potential benefits from the merger that accrue to consumers. Of course, offsetting this benefit of network effects may be something that we are all familiar with and sort of is the standard worry of pricing power. When you don't have competitors, you as the company can charge higher prices. But another offsetting mechanism may be that of platform differentiation. The fact that platforms cater to different types of consumers or learn to cater to different types of consumers. And so combining the two platforms, destroying one may actually be harmful to the consumers who lost their favorite one. And this is actually a dimension that I would say has been relatively understudied in the platform literature. Of course, the net benefit is going to be a function of this, and it's hard to empirically test it because we need a setting with a merger and data on the entire market. And so hopefully we found such a setting in the market for pet sitting platforms. I'll be more specific about which platforms I'm talking about, but roughly it's Airbnb for dogs, for your dogs, okay? So our main question is really how large are indirect network effects from the merger. And I'm really focusing on indirect network effects, sort of benefits that come to buyers because there's a lot of sellers on the platform, and benefits that come to sellers because there are a lot of buyers from the platforms, and that are not just due to competitive effects. You know, when you have more sellers, the prices go down. That's not just that, it's also an improvement in variety and match quality, okay? First, we're going to ask whether they even exist. surprisingly, there's very little evidence on whether these network effects exist and are large in platform markets. They are an integral part of the definition of platforms, but there's very limited empirical evidence. And so specifically, to answer that question, we're going to answer what is the effect of increasing the number of participants on the acquiring platform, on the platform that actually acquired their largest competitor and had a big influx of users coming to their platform. Okay. Conditional on finding these network effects, surprise, surprise, we'll find some evidence of network effects. We ask whether these network effects are large enough to justify a dominant platform. So once we take out the potentially negative effects of the merger, do we still see a benefit for the users, such as 1 + 1 is greater than 2, okay? The empirical strategy relies on the fact that pet sitting services are very local in nature. So if I have a dog and I look for a dog sitter in Boston, I don't care how many dog sitters exist in San Francisco. And so we can really separate the platform into multiple geographic markets. And because we have data from both platforms before the merger, and we have data from the merged platform after the merger, we can see that before merging, the two platforms compete at the local level and offer similar services. Other options, which I'll be discussing a little bit, are less substitutable. And we have, importantly, variation across local geographies in the market shares. So in some geographies, one of the two platforms is dominant. In other geographies, we have sort of the two platforms competing on equal ground. And so with these data, we're going to try to compare geographies where the acquiring platform was dominant. That is going to be sort of our control group. With other geographies, we'll have multiple treatments before and after the merger. Okay? As a preview of the results, we're going to reject large benefits for the market. 1 + 1 is equal to 2 in terms of various proxies for the value that consumers obtain from these platforms, in terms of total matches, in terms of match rates, and in terms of other outcomes. In particular, these sort of null effect at the market level comes from two offsetting effects: worse outcomes for existing users of the acquired platform and better outcomes for existing users of the acquiring platforms. So these two distributional effects are going to offset at the market level such that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. And outcomes for new users are unchanged. The acquiring platform is going to enjoy large benefits from the merger. Some of these benefits are due to a change in the composition of users, which I'm going to be specific about, and that's the main reason why we need data from two platforms as opposed to data from a single platform. But they also have large benefits through network effects. In particular, existing users of the acquiring platform really are able to post more requests. They match at the same rate, but because they post more requests and find help, they actually end up with more transactions on the platform after the merger. The related literature, I'm not going to do any justice to the very wide empirical literature, to the really wide theoretical and empirical literature on platforms. One thing that I would want to say is that theory really has made the presence of network effects an integral part of the definition of platforms. But there's relatively limited empirical evidence on how large these network effects are. Each of the three authors have been part of this study, have been part of previous research trying to estimate network effects. But we were all left a little bit unconvinced. Typically, we found constant or decreasing returns to scale, but we also used only within platform variation or data from a single platform. And we focused on only a subset of potential mechanisms. We didn't really have all the sort of search, matching, and transaction funnel to really look at this very closely. We're not going to do anything different than other studies that looked at mergers in other industries, non-platform industries such as healthcare and beer, and the beer industry. And so we're going to apply some of their techniques, very simple diff and diff, reduced form techniques, to look at these in the context of platforms. Okay, so before I move to describing the setting, are there any questions that I can address right now?
So far, there aren't any, but I will keep you posted.
Got it. Thank you so much. Okay, so if you are in the US and you have a dog, you may have heard of these companies. If you're outside of the US and you may not. But the first company, the company that eventually acquires the largest competitor, is Rover. It's called Rover. At the time of the merger, and for all intents and purposes throughout the last 10 years, Rover has been the largest peer-to-peer dog sitting platform. It's a dog sitting platform that allows dog owners to ship their dog, to send their dog, not ship, to send their dog to the dog sitter, and the dog can stay there, can sleep at the dog sitter's house for as long as the owner needs it. Okay, and this dog boarding, that's the service that I've described, is really over 80–90% of the business on both of the platforms that I'm going to describe today. They have other services like house sitting, drop visits, doggy daycare, and dog walking, but they are really a fringe of their business and not the topic of today's conversation. Okay, to find dog boarding services, a dog owner would submit a request by including the location where they're looking for help, the drop-off date, and the pickup date. So location and time, and some information about the size of the dog. This creates a request, which then allows the dog owner to be presented with a list of service providers that are available that satisfy the criteria and that are ranked according to the proprietary algorithms of these platforms. When a dog owner starts communicating with these sitters about their availability and their willingness to take care of their dog, this creates an inquiry, a conversation between these two parties. And when at least a pair sort of confirms that they want to transact, a stay is formed. And then we can see ratings, we can see propensity to come back, and so on and so forth. We have all of these data from both platforms. Rover is the first. The second largest platform is DogVacay. And again, their website is exactly the same. You change the face of the dog and maybe the face of the owner, and it's exactly the same system. You search for boarding, you input the zip code, you input the start date, the end date, and you find a sitter. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, the search and matching mechanism is pretty similar. They also charged very similar commission fees. Not just in nominal terms. The nominal commission fee was 15% up until mid-2015, and then it turned to 20%, but also in terms of actual commission fees, which is sort of the wedge that the platform keeps between what the buyer pays and the seller receives, divided by what the buyer pays. And that actual commission fee, so net of promotions, net of bonuses, net of all of these things, has also been pretty similar between the two platforms. It was capped around 15% for a long period of time. Then it started increasing gradually. Because the 20% commission fee was only levied on new service providers. So as new service providers sort of replaced older service providers, the effective commission fee increased gradually. And then it went above 20% because they also had fixed booking fees that were not a percent of the transaction price, but were fixed as a function of the request being submitted. Okay, and one thing to notice is that immediately after the merger, there is no discontinuous change in this average commission fee, nor the nominal or the actual. We're going to take these as a given. We've done some more analysis in the paper, but we're going to take this as given, and we're just going to take it as evidence that at least in the year following the merger, the dominant platform did not take advantage of market power to increase their prices. Okay. I told you Rover and DogVacay were the largest competitors in the online dog sitting market, and literally they dominated the online sitting market. Other options were a little bit less substitutable. WAG, some of you may be familiar with it. It was exclusively on-demand dog walking at the time, and so it wasn't really a competitor for the service that we're focusing on. Traditional kennels, doggy hotels, kennels, were and are still an important option. Based on surveys that the two platforms conducted with their users, it doesn't seem like their users were substituting between traditional kennels and Rover or DogVacay, but they were rather substituting away from friends and families, or not traveling, or traveling with their dogs. Okay, so there is a sense in which these platforms were really expanding the market from an option that was unmeasured before. In 2017, that's when the merger happened. And here's the timeline. The timeline is particularly important for our setting. In February of 2017, Rover agreed to acquire DogVacay. At the end of March, the merger was formally announced. And in at the end of July, DogVacay, the second largest platform, was completely shut down. What that meant, let me show you, is that if you went on DogVacay, you would be told that DogVacay was joining the Rover pack, and the only way for you to find a sitter was to click on find a Rover sitter. So you couldn't really use the DogVacay platform any longer. Now, in the interim period, okay, these 4 months between March and July, DogVacay users were allowed to migrate to Rover. Migration was incentivized because if you migrated from DogVacay, you could port all of your reputation history from DogVacay to Rover, and so all your ratings were sort of ported into the acquiring platform. Why did Rover acquire DogVacay and shut down the website? We don't really have sort of a public case from the Department of Justice or the FTC, which suggests to us that the merger was not deemed important enough to impact competition in this market. DogVacay was basically struggling to keep up with Rover's recent cash injections. They were both growing on the basis of, marketing and attracting new users. And so when you don't have as much cash as your competitor, you start losing ground. And Rover shut down DogVacay, so literally shut down the website, not because of their deep understanding of network effects or the characteristics of the synergies that they could create between the two platforms, but rather because of technological complexities of having two technology stacks in a period of very fast growth. Rover was still trying to expand right at that time, not just in the US, but also globally. And so they just wanted to expand with one tech stack and one set of engineers and data scientists. And so, as I mentioned, DogVacay landing page starting in July 2017, DogVacay disappeared for all intents and purposes. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what happened before the merger. That's important to understand because characteristics of the competition between the two platforms is going to help us understand the extent to which we should expect network effects to arise. Okay, so we're going to look at three characteristics where these platforms compete on a geographic level. We're going to look at whether their prices or their users at least perceive these two platforms as good substitutes, as almost perfect substitutes. And we're going to look at the extent of multi-homing, because when you have a lot of multi-homing, so users participating on both platforms, merging the two platforms should not give rise to any benefits of combining the two platforms, because all users, even before the merger, had access to all the service providers and dog owners at the same time. Okay, so here's just a plot of the growth in total stays in a given month, transacted in a given month, for Rover and DogVacay. You can see that Rover started a little bit ahead, mostly because Rover started earlier. DogVacay caught up pretty quickly because their strategy was expanding really geographically as fast as possible. But then Rover sort of caught up, and eventually after the merger, which is this vertical line, Rover obtained and absorbed all of the transactions on DogVacay. There were still some transactions happening here, mostly because these were transactions that were booked before the platform was closed, but for dates that were after, that occurred after the platform was closed. So the two platforms were of similar sizes. The two platforms were also competing in the same geographies, and what is nice for our purpose is that there is some nice variation in the market share of Rover, measured as the share of gross transaction volume in 2016 from Rover divided by the sum of the two gross transaction volumes. So money exchanged on the platform. You can see that there's quite a nice uniform distribution on sort of the market share between 0 and 1. There's a lot of geographies here that have either Rover or DogVacay completely dominant, and that comes from like more rural geographies that each of the platform was happy to leave to the other competitor. There is some selection into these geographies, into these zip codes. The zip codes where one of the two platforms was dominant. So look at these sort of two columns where Rover had either 0 to 20% market share in 2016, the year before the merger, or 80 to 100%. They tend to be to have lower population density, lower share of college degree residents. They also tend to have a lower population altogether. So there is some selection. We're going to try and keep that in mind as we sort of compare geographies that are that have Rover as the dominant platform with geography where both platforms tend to compete on equal grounds.
Hey, Chiara, there's one question by Christian. Whether the shutdown of DogVacay is evidence that brand value is not important at all in this market.
Yeah, so it turns out it's probably going to be very important. So that's sort of as a preview of our results, because what we will see is that DogVacay users are going to attrit and leave the market altogether. And this can be because brand is important, because there's consumer inertia, because there's switching costs. We cannot really pinpoint, but it actually provides a rationale for why so many other platforms that merged, think about, online travel agencies, have kept the websites, the platforms as separate. It was not in their mind when they merged, though. Okay, so competing in approximately similar geographies, when we think about the two platforms from a price perspective, we can look at the average transacted prices and see whether there's any difference between DogVacay and Rover in terms of transacted prices for these services. What we see is that DogVacay had about 6.7% higher prices. These price premium on DogVacay stays once we control for sort of zip code year month fixed effects and stay duration fixed effects. But what is interesting is that when we actually control for the same provider multi-homing, meaning transacted in the same month on both platforms, that multi-homer was treating the two platforms as perfect substitutes. They were charging exactly the same price. So this to us gives us some suggestive evidence that at least for certain users, these two platforms are good substitutes. And so if we combine them, we should see network effects arising. And finally, multi-homing is one of the crucial aspects that sort of may, allow network effects to realize or not. And so we define users as multi-homing if they've engaged in a transaction on Rover and DogVacay, in at least one transaction on Rover and DogVacay in the 5 years before the merger. So it's quite a generous definition of multi-homing, I would say. And according to that definition, only 8% of sellers and 3% of buyers multi-home, meaning they exchanged sort of transactions on both platforms, at least once on both platforms. We're pretty confident that we're capturing multi-homing here because we're, for some users, of course, the migration allows us to tell us who's who in the two platforms. But for others that didn't migrate, the use of their email address was actually crucial in being able to merge them. Now, I know that we may all have different email addresses that we use for different platforms, but conditional on actually being active on a platform, we tend to use the same email address. And so we're pretty confident that we're really capturing the extent of multi-homing in this market. Now, despite being a small share of buyers and sellers, if we think of them, if we weigh these users in terms of their transactions, they are the heavier users. So 27% of transactions are made by multi-homing sellers, which is significant, not the model behavior, but significant. And 8% are actually made of these transactions are made by multi-homing buyers, okay? So yes, some multi-homing exists, but definitely it's not the case that all users had access to all users, regardless of which platform they were using, okay? And so combining the two, if they are substitutable, if they compete in the same geographies, would give rise to some nice network effects if they exist. All right, so how are we gonna use the post-merger data, the pre-merger and post-merger, to really get at our questions? So we're going to assume, and I've sort of shown you some evidence, that platform commissions do not change in nominal terms, do not change in actual terms. And so increased product variety and higher match quality can lead to more requests, higher probability that requests are matched, and or higher customer retention. Any increase on any of these margin is going to be suggestive evidence of network effects, okay? So we're going to do these in two steps. We're going to measure network effects at the platform level. We're going to basically use data only from Rover. The only data that we use from DogVacay is really in order to allocate zip codes, geographies, into geographies with more or less competition from DogVacay. And we're going to look at what happens on Rover, in the outcomes on Rover, as there is more or less influx of users coming from the acquired platform. And then we're going to evaluate whether the network effects that we find up here are large enough to emerge at the market level. So are large enough, even when we take into account the fact that there may be people who leave the platforms because of brand loyalty, as Christian mentioned, because of consumer inertia, because of switching costs, what have you. All right, so we're going to exploit variation in pre-merger market shares. With network effects and nothing else, these are our predictions. At the platform level, Rover users are going to benefit more in geographies where DogVacay was large pre-merger. I'll give you a graphical intuition for this. And at the market level, users are going to benefit more in geographies where the two platforms split the pre-merger market about 50-50. Okay, so let me give you an intuition for that. When we have, increasing benefits from the number of users, from platform size, the average surplus per user is going to be an increasing function of the number of users, okay? So now let's consider two geographies. One geography where Rover has 90% of the market, 90 users, and another geography where Rover has 51% of the market, 51 users, okay? If nothing else happens, so when we have the merger and all of the users move to point C, so are combined into the single platform, the user level surplus is going to be denoted by C. But this increasing user surplus is going to be higher in market A than in market B. Sort of that is sort of a very simple function of the distance to point C. Okay, and this is a diff and diff coefficient that we can bring to the data and estimate. Now, if this is true graphically, if surplus per user is increasing in the number of users at the platform level and nothing else happens at the market level, what happens is that the aggregate user surplus, or the weighted average of the user per surplus, is actually a convex curve in the number of users, okay, in the number of users. And this convexity is really going to be the reason behind our estimates of network effects. It's the fact that a market now where the two platforms split the market 51-49 is going to jump and increase welfare a lot more than a market in which one of the two platforms is already dominant because of Jensen inequality, okay? And so if you sort of follow these analyses, again, this is nothing more than a diff and diff coefficient that we can bring to the data and estimate whether it's greater than 0, less than 0, or equal to 0. So we're going to take advantage of this variation in Rover market share before the merger. Again, we're constraining our markets at the zip code level, and we're constraining them to have at least 50 transactions being exchanged in 2016. So it's not a lot of transaction in 365 years. Turns out that it doesn't change whether we take out these sort of extreme markets. We're going to divide these geographies into 5 groups. Okay, the thresholds are going to be 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%. Okay, and we're going to consider the market where Rover has at least 80% market share in 2016 as our control group. We're going to assume, to some extent, that these markets are not going to see a huge change in how buyers and sellers transact because Rover, the acquiring platform, was already dominant. And we're going to compare outcomes in the other treatment groups relative to the control group. We're going to have treatment group 1, 2, 3, and 4, depending on the Rover market share before the merger. Why do we divide these into 4 groups? Well, because the platform level effects are sort of monotone in the Rover market share. So we would expect that Rover benefits more, the platform Rover benefits more in geographies where it was smaller and hence receives a much bigger influx of users from the acquiring platform compared to geographies where Rover was already big enough. Okay, so that's sort of the monotonicity that we expect when we estimate platform level effects. We don't have these monotonicity at the market level effect. We would expect that if symmetry holds, that the effect where Rover is very, very small, DogVacay is dominant, is the same as the effect in the control group. So we should not see any differences. And in particular, if network effects exist and do not cancel out even after taking into account other things that may happen because of the merger, we should expect the benefits to be greatest in markets where Rover was competing on equal grounds with DogVacay.
Chiara, there is another question by Ananya Sen. Going to unmute him real quick.
Oh, hi, Chiara. Just trying to understand why do you think there's so much variation in market share? Because that's since you're these are treatment and control groups. It's important for identification. So just trying to understand, is it just like historical trajectories or some characteristics which can muddy your results or not?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And so we have some suggestive evidence that there's historical reasons for why market shares are the way they are. So typically, if a platform enters before, that's predictive of that platform having a higher market share eventually. I think your question also asked about sort of geographic specific advertising. That didn't happen beyond the launch in a particular city, so early on. And by constraining geographies to have at least 50 transactions in 2016, that guarantees us that early push, that early marketing push was gone by the time of our merger. So the two platforms have had quite different entry strategies. One was focusing more on urban geographies, and one was focusing more on rural geography, not on rural, on anything, basically on anything that's stuck, which meant that it was a little bit more dominant. That second platform was a little bit more dominant in rural geographies. But beyond that, we don't have a clear sense that there is something that's particularly correlated with the outcomes that we are interested in. We're gonna, in addition to that, we're gonna try and actually match the treatment and control zip codes so that they are actually having a similar growth trend before the merger in the number of users that they had on any given month in the year preceding the merger. So we're going to try and match, in addition to taking that at least some of these variation is exogenous.
And sorry, maybe I'll take the opportunity for a quick follow-up. And you're talking about zip codes. Isn't zip codes like slightly too narrow, or is that like, are you being conservative there, or like, because there could be spillovers like beyond the zip code, right?
Yeah, so also very relevant question. It's a trade-off between signal and noise. So like, with zip codes, we have a lot more information, a lot of more observations. And so we're trying to sort of reduce the confidence intervals, but we do the analysis by clustering zip codes based on the search behavior that we can actually get from one of the two companies. And the results are exactly the same with just wider standard errors. But yes, your worry is exactly right, and we had it, and that's why we sort of did it at both levels of aggregation. Finer because of variance, and coarser because of spillovers. Okay, so now can I move on? I think I see.
Maybe one quick follow-up question and the other one for the later. Larry White asks why you create 4 groups instead of holding the continuous market shares, the original ones.
Yeah, so it's because we wanted to have this comparison. So that's a good question. We wanted to keep the comparison in the markets for the platform level effects and the market level effects. And because of the lack of symmetry at the market level effects, we wanted to be sure that we were comparing the same geographies in the two platforms. One could definitely do, an absolute level relative to the 0.5. The results are very similar. You'll see in a second that the results are very monotone. So a continuous measure keeps the results, as I'll show you.
Let me just add, it just feels like you're throwing away information, you're aggregating when you don't need to. Clearly, with the effects that you're looking for on the current slide, you just do some kind of nonlinear relationship, the market share and market share squared, so that you could get an inverted parabola. It just, at a minimum, you ought to do some robustness tests on what happens if you vary the number of blocks and where the dividing lines are. But my instincts would be to stay with the original market share data unless there's an overwhelming story to say we ought to be thinking in terms of aggregate blocks rather than continuity.
Yeah, so that's a fair point. Again, the dependent variables, so the treatment variables would have to change between these and these by necessity, because here there's monotonicity, and so we would want the market share, while here we would want the absolute deviation of the market share compared to 0.5. Okay, and it actually that imposes the symmetry, which is a further assumption that we don't have in our bucketing, the way we're bucketing it this way. Nonetheless, the results are pretty much the same.
Well, just to finish it off, if you did an inverted parabola estimation, you could find out whether the peak of the inverted parabola was, relatively close to the midpoint, the 50% point, or not.
Yeah, sure. I think we would have some trouble with the matching at that point, because what we're doing here, for each treatment, we find a particular control group match. And so the control group at that point, we won't have as nice a paired match with the continuous variable, but it's certainly something that we can do. We've done it without the match control, using the continuous variable and the absolute deviation from the 0.5, and it doesn't change. We like the beauty of the event study that I'm going to show you in a second, but fair point. Okay, so I mentioned the matching. We're going to do covariate balancing propensity score matching, and distances are calculated on active sellers in each month up to a year before the merger. I'm just going to show you outcomes for buyers, but outcomes for sellers are exactly the same. We are going to regress sort of the difference between the treated and the matched control zip code in a given month on a bunch of time fixed effects. And the outcomes that I'm going to show you today, we have many more outcomes in the paper, are total transactions match rate at the platform level, so using only data from Rover, and at the market level, where we aggregate the outcomes in a given month and in a given geography as the sum of Rover and DogVacay. Okay, we have some robustness checks. One that I already mentioned with clustering zip codes, diff and diff, and other outcomes, including seller side outcomes, that I'm happy to discuss in the 15 minutes after the presentation. I'm going to show you a bunch of event studies. Okay, so we're going to normalize the control group at 0, and in particular, we're going to normalize February 2017 at 0. And what we would expect to see if the merger affects the particular outcome that we care about is, all coefficients hovering around 0 before the merger, then maybe a jump or an increase during the interim period when some users were allowed to migrate to the platform that acquired the other, and then an eventual jump and stabilization after DogVacay was completely shut down. So that's what we would expect to see. We're going to start by saying something that we expect, which is the effect on match rate at the platform level. So this is the match rate on Rover pre-post merger relative to markets where Rover was dominant. And you can see that when Rover is small, so it receives a much bigger influx of users from the acquired platform, the match rate increases by up to 20 percentage points. That's a huge number, okay? And this increase is sort of monotonically decreasing as we expected in the market share of Rover. Now, if we only had data from Rover, we would close it here and say, okay, this is evidence of network effects. Actually, that doesn't take into account the fact that the composition of users may be changing. Rover may be attracting new users that are easier to match. And that's exactly what we find. So we actually separate the match rate for 3 different groups of users: new users that never transacted before that particular focal month on either platform, Rover buyers, and DogVacay buyers. And what we see is that their own match rate compared to before the merger and compared to the control group just does not change. All of these lines are relatively flat. Okay, so the increase in match rate that we see in the aggregate outcome is due to the fact that an easier set of users that are easier to match are coming from DogVacay to Rover, and that bumps up the match rate by a very significant amount. So that's a huge benefit for Rover, but it's not evidence of network effects. Okay, now we can look at the same users, Rover, DogVacay, and new, not on match rate on the intensive margins, but rather on the extensive margin. And here's where we see evidence of network effects. We see that users of Rover are actually posting more requests and they are matching at the same rate. And that translates into higher stays, about 40% higher stays, higher number of stays in markets that receive the bigger influx of users from the acquired platform. And this is really our evidence of network effects. People, users post more because they have more people to choose from, and that leads to big benefits for the acquired platform. These big benefits for the acquiring platform, come at a cost though. Come at a cost for DogVacay users. Users of the acquired platform are now actually posting way fewer stays, and that reduction is particularly big where DogVacay was large. And so this attrition is leading to a reduction in the number of requests that are posted by DogVacay users. There's an increase in the number of requests that come from Rover users. So what happens at the market level? 1 + 1 = 2. So when we look at the market level, what happens is that both in terms of stays and in terms of match rate, so intensive and extensive margins, 1 + 1 = 2. Now here, we cannot exclude effects of up to 10, 20 percentage points, but the effects are really, really noisy, okay? And so this is, so the attrition by DogVacay users is crucial. And so we wanna try and understand whether this type of attrition is generalizable to other platforms like Uber, Lyft, that may merge and may not, and may see a reduction in the usage because of this attrition. What it turns out, and this is sort of purely suggestive evidence, but what turns out is that at least on this platform, it's particularly important. The repeated transactions are particularly important. People who like a dog sitter like to transact with that dog sitters over and over and over and over again. And so we have a sense in which, you know, if a seller migrated to the acquiring platform to Rover, that makes it also more likely, that's associated with a higher likelihood that the buyer themselves is also migrating to the platform, is also transacting. And so if their counterparty is not migrating to that platform, they are also now migrating to that platform. And this may be because they stop transacting. This may be because they bring the transaction offline. We cannot exclude that, okay? But so because I want to leave sort of some minutes for the discussion, let me conclude. We sort of started asking whether users are better off with a single platform or two competing platforms. And we use this variation in competition across geographies and found that the merger benefits the acquiring platform, but not the market as a whole. It doesn't damage the market as a whole, but it doesn't benefit it either. And the merger improves particularly outcomes for Rover users at the expense of DogVacay users. I haven't shown this, but there's little heterogeneity across different types of markets. And so if we try to sort of summarize this specific case and generalize to other mergers, one platform in this specific case is similar to two competing platforms because the platform level benefits are offset by users' horizontal preferences. Is this for brand? Is this for consumer inertia? Is this for switching costs? We don't know. But there's horizontal preferences. This is a short-term result. There may be other network effects that can take time to realize. There may be pricing power that can take time to realize. And we ignore cost efficiency. But as we think about other mergers, if you're worried about future market power, so the exploitation of market power in the future and increased prices, this study shows no market level network effects offsetting that worry. So you should still be worried about market power. And hopefully we've highlighted important dimensions of heterogeneity and user composition that are worth discussing in platform markets. And a bit as an answer to Christian's first question, many other platforms that merged didn't combine the two platforms, and maybe they did it right because there was a lot of brand or preference for the particular platform that a user was using. And with this, I'm going to conclude, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I'm going to start with the questions. The first one is by Pallavi Pal. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So I have a question related to how you divide the markets. You divide the markets according to the market share for Rover. Is that sort of assuming that the leftover market share goes to DogVacay?
Yes, absolutely. So the denominator is the sum of gross transaction volume of Rover and DogVacay.
Okay, so what if there are a few markets in which Rover has a smaller share, but the other share is gone to someone else, which is not gone to DogVacay, some other?
We cannot measure that something else. So that something else will not be part of our denominator. It's a good question. So if kennels are much bigger in San Francisco than in Boston, we're not capturing that. We have zip codes fixed effects, and we hold that constant.
So you're not capturing, for say, if both of them were like small in a particular market, and you just find that Rover was smaller than DogVacay, you will treat that same as a market in which both of them were big. So you're
No, that's not correct. So we are actually controlling for the fact that that particular geography is smaller than another geography where both of them are much larger.
I'm saying if there is a market in which there are 3 players, in which DogVacay and Rover have very small shares, and the third player has a big share, versus a market in which DogVacay and Rover have big shares. So
again, the diff and diff relies on the fact that that third player stays constant, whether it's big or small. Okay. It stays constant.
Okay. Do you do any sort of robust check for that?
We cannot measure that third option.
But that's, you can measure that by the total market share of the 2 companies, right?
No, because we compute the denominator as the sum of gross transaction volume of the 2 platforms.
Okay, next question would be by Larry White. I'm gonna unmute you.
Okay, unclear in this kind of platform, if I've had a satisfactory sitting experience with a sitter, I want to do it again. Why do the repeat transactions happen through the platform? I already know the sitter's name, telephone number, email, physical, postal, and geographic address. How come you see any repeat transactions through the platform?
Great question. I'm glad you asked it because I didn't address it in the presentation, but it's super important. So 60% of our transactions in a given month are repeated transactions. So that's huge, right? There is disintermediation, and these platforms are typically worried about disintermediations, but there are strong incentives to keep the transactions online and pay the fee. The incentives are strongest on the seller side. So the seller is actually ranked higher in the search algorithms if they have repeated transactions on the platform, on top of having good online reputation. And so there is a strong incentives for them to get more business to keep their existing business on the platform. On the buyer side, there's arguably less incentives, but the platform actually creates value during the transaction. So if a dog is sick, they have like sort of veterinary services that can be accessed. It has a sort of dispute resolution post-transaction. And for certain buyers, that's a good enough reason to keep the transaction online.
All right. Hannes has another question. Yes.
Yeah. So I was wondering whether it could be at all plausible, and whether the size of attrition is large enough that network effects could, realize later. So I think you have a bit less than a year after the merger, and so what if these people go offline and they transact offline for a while because it works, and then they all come back? I don't know. Have you thought about it? Is this plausible? Or...
Absolutely plausible, right? Like, I disintermediate the current transaction. Now my dog owner or my dog sitter disappears and moves out of my city. And so I have to go back and create new relationships. That's absolutely plausible. It becomes a little bit harder for us to argue. First of all, it doesn't happen in the time span that we have data for. But, the further away from the merger we get, the harder it becomes to argue that it's due to the merger and not something else.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe one last question by Ananya Sen. Still in time. I unmuted you.
Oh yeah, sorry. I think I had the same sort of question as Hannes, like about the timeline, that it's like a few months after, and with total stays going down for DogVacay, is that just like a short-term friction? You're like, things are all over the place with the merger. You don't know what's happening. Yeah. So I think you sort of tried to answer that.
Yeah, it lasts at least until December 2017. And so people, they typically, like, December is actually a great time to keep, and we wanted to keep it because for Christmas, for the holidays, for the winter holidays, a lot of people request help. And at least up until that help, they don't come back.
So maybe one very last question by Christian. He also has one.
Chiara, this is a really, really cool paper. Awesome data. So really cool paper. I just had a thought on the multi-homing piece. So there might be different costs associated to multi-home for buyers and sellers. So if I'm a seller, then I have to double check that I'm not double booking and sort of keep a calendar, and it's more costly than for a buyer to just shop around and compare prices and so on. And that might also affect the value that you get from increased network size. So is there anything have you thought in that direction? I'm not even sure, what it would mean, but.
Yeah. So calendar updating. I mean, Andrey has a paper, his job market paper, was looking at these calendar updating as a source of friction. The platforms have worked a lot in trying to make calendar updating as seamless as possible. In addition to that, some dog owners, and it's difficult for us to understand who's who, but some dog owners actually like if there's another dog in the house of the sitter. Sometimes sitters have their own dogs, so it's not that conditional on having one transaction you cannot have another one if you're a pet sitter, and so that complicates a little bit our analysis. But certainly, multi-homing is not, at a first approximation, multi-homing is not necessarily dominant for sellers if the reputation is spread out across two platforms, right? Because, instead of having 10 reviews and 10 sort of repeated transactions on a single platform, I now spread it into two that may give me less bang for my buck, for my reputation. And so it's not obvious where this multi-homing is how that multi-homing is interacting with network effects.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I'm afraid we are out of time for the official Q&A. And thanks again for this very interesting talk. And before we wrap up, I think I'll hand over to Hannes.
Yeah, also thanks from my side. This was really an exciting talk, very cool paper. An announcement to everyone. So we will meet again in 2 weeks' time on May 6th, a Thursday. Our next guest will be John Horton from MIT Sloan. Yeah, same time, again, location of your limited choice, and we hope to see many of you again. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the questions.